A close inspection of the psychoanalytic contributions on the question and meaning of truth is almost exclusively centered on clinical phenomena, while a genuinely unique philosophical theory peculiar to psychoanalysis remains unrealized. Throughout this presentation, I'm interested in ferreting out the possibility of providing a novel perspective on psychoanalytic truth. I wish to situate my argument in the tradition of the ancient notion of aletheia, where truth is defined as a process of disclosedness or unconcealedness. I will attempt to show that truth appears as the manifestation of particularized psychic expressions that have their source in an unconscious ontology teleologically motivated to disclose itself. Yet the manifestations of such disclosures transpire within a broader dialectical process that constitutes its totality. While each act of disclosedness reveals a particular truth via its manifestations, it simultaneously involves a closing or covering over of other facets of psychic life, insofar as each act of unconcealment dialectically stimulates other acts of concealment governed by unconscious agentic forces. Although truth is the appearance of multiplicity, it also participates of a supraordinate dynamics complex holism mediated by mind. The meaning of truth is encumbered by its history. There has been a preponderant focus on the binary between realism and idealism, or on the essential and mind-independent qualities of truth as objective fact versus our conceptualization and experience of what we perceive and conceive to be, as well as on definitional parameters of truth, which traditionally refers to a static property of a logical proposition. It may not be possible to transcend this burden. However, it's misleading to think of truth as one thing, which is a category mistake. Rather, we should conceive of truth as being divided into different kinds or particulars, which may belong to a certain class. In other words, particulars may participate of certain forms or categories of truth. Let me distinguish between three categories of truth. The ontology of truth, which is to do with being and essence. The epistemology of truth, which has to do with the criterion of knowledge, interpretation, belief, and justification. And the phenomenology of truth, which has to do with how truth appears or manifests. These are distinct discourses, although they overlap and coexist on parallel process levels, with various degrees of interdependence operative at any given moment. What is important for the purposes of psychoanalytic observation and applied theory is to define and elucidate the kinds of truth that inhere in a particular category or form. Although neither inclusive nor complete, hence in need of further reflection and development, these three categories may serve as a guide for offering a descriptive analysis of truth as a meta-theory, rather than as a prescriptive or definitive one. Whether psychoanalysis is concerned with describing an ontological state of affairs, such as correspondence theory, determining the logical relations between statements that fit properly within a system of interpretation and knowledge, typically coherence theory, or allowing the patient's unique lived experience to unfold in the treatment encounter, maybe pragmatic, the analytic task becomes defined by its context and purpose in relation to the various ways truth may appear. For example, the goals of theoretical and applied psychoanalysis may be entirely different from clinical theory, methodology, pedagogy, and praxis. As shifting contexts and aims present themselves, so do questions regarding psychoanalytic truth. Within the context of treatment, the question of truth speaks to a certain psychological relevation and impact it has on the subject. whose unique subjectivity is affected on the most archaic levels, regulating unconscious organizing principles. This further applies to the analyst's subjectivity and its felt reverberation on the therapeutic dyad. Here, practical matters are most important, for truth is ultimately about personal lived experience as self-realization and self-honesty within an intersubjective space that promotes and facilitates this burgeoning process. Here, truth may be said to transpire within the broader domains of authenticity, creativity, and valuation that permeate the analytic encounter. In this context, truth may be adjudicated based on its genuineness, openness, frank candor, or brute manifestation in the actual moment. Here we should not view truth as an absolute category that discloses itself in its entirety, but rather as a contextual process that reveals itself a bit at a time and from many different vantage points or perspectives. This is what we witness in the consulting room. Because there are so many versions of truth that emphasize constructivist, linguistic, semantic, and performative features of speech acts, where assent, consensus, and endorsement of statements determine the strictures of truth, as well as theories we will not even touch upon, such as deflationary, minimalist, prostantential, and redundancy perspectives in reference to truth predicates. On the face of things, it appears prudent to endorse a pluralistic thesis of truth where more than just one property makes a proposition true depending upon the context. Here, truth becomes delineated as a functional property that is multiply instantiated. Psychoanalysts, by and large, are not concerned with these scholarly controversies as they are with practical matters germane to their craft. From this standpoint, a meta-theory of truth, tailored to particular questions, purposes, and contexts, may be the most sensible option on the table. But whatever approach we adopt, itself conditioned on warranted assertability susceptible to fallibility, we must concede that it's always open to flux and dynamic change based on the fact that there will never be a final end of inquiry where all data, ideas, and knowledge is complete, perfectly sufficient, and immune from further revision. This further shows that truth will always be a relative or contingent matter, depending upon what constitutes our definitions of adequacy and completeness, which ultimately stands in relation to people's penumbral goals, purposes, methodologies, and modes of discourse. Lacan once said that when a patient speaks, he speaks the truth, but never the whole truth. We can never enunciate the whole truth, for it appears only in partial expressions. Here we may say that truth is harbored unconsciously, or as Aristotle put it, the soul possesses truth. The psychoanalyst's pursuit of truth is that of the soul searcher, the psyche-analyst, whose mission it is to observe and interpret unconscious phenomenology. And may I further add, to heal suffering when possible. I suggest that the quest for truth is most useful as a phenomenological project, that is, how it appears. Truth manifestations are imbued with meaning, value, and explanatory power, and this becomes an idiosyncratic enterprise. To quote Aristotle, for the truth is not that what appears exists, but that what appears exists for him to whom it appears, and when, and in the sense in which, and in the way in which it appears, end quote. Here, truth involves metacontextual interpretation. Whatever appears must be accompanied by a hermeneutical referent in order to lend any significance or meaning to appearance. Therefore, appearance and interpretation are coextensive, yet conjoined as a phenomenon-hermeneutic unit. The question facing psychoanalysis in terms of truth is how do we interpret appearance. In section 44 of Being and Time, Heidegger discusses the relationship between Dasein, disclosedness, and truth. This was the beginning of his later preoccupation with the pre-Socratic notion of aletheia, which he translates as Unbehogenheit, or unconcealedness. Truth as aletheia is a form of disclosure, unconcealment, or uncoveredness that reveals itself through that which appears. Heidegger argues that Plato's and Aristotle's interpretation of truth as correctness distorted its original meaning, and hence a proper return to the first inception of understanding the iteration of being was his cardinal concern. Lethe is the river of forgetfulness in Greek mythology. Aletheia is its reversal, hence an unforgetting of what was previously hidden. In psychoanalysis, the paradigmatic example of this phenomenon is the return of the repressed. Heidegger was fastidious in investigating how the truth of being was disclosed or uncovered from its hiddenness. This discourse fits nicely in a psychoanalytic paradigm because we are principally interested in, one, the act of uncovering the unconscious elements of a patient's subjectivity, and two, the specific uncoverings of what is disclosed, namely the contents and details of mental objects, memories, fantasies, linkages to past representations, and so on. The notion of truth as unhiddenness also points to a process of how unconscious phenomena unfold and divulge themselves to the subject and the analyst. Truth can only exist if it's revealed. But for Heidegger, what is disclosed or shines forth is something that was always present but hidden. Here we have a fine discourse on unconscious phenomenology. In Heidegger's treatment of phenomenon, he is concerned with highlighting the distinct nuances of disclosure that cannot be reduced to a simple uniformity. The English word truth is therefore an imposition because it forces a single categorization on appearance, when truth eludes such categorization in its distinct moments. When we refer here to appearance, we do not mean semblance, or that which looks like what it is not, but rather that which shows itself in itself, the manifest. When Heidegger begins unpacking the meaning of phenomenon as the manifest, or that which shows itself, we immediately begin to see how convoluted the concept of truth becomes. Heidegger speaks of a double entendre of appearance as something that announces itself, and in this sense is showing itself. But this showing is merely semblance, hence not a true showing itself, which makes it non-manifest. Therefore, what is taken as manifest could be merely a veil. What is behind the veil is the task of psychoanalytic inquiry. But in order not to further muddle our conventional discourse, for our purposes here, phenomenon and appearance should be viewed as equivalent constructs. Heidegger's reintroduction of the ancient concept of truth has many nuances that have direct bearing on the subtleness of psychoanalytic observation and interpretive technique. For example, to disclose is to open or reverse a closure. To reveal is to remove the veil, and to discover is to undo the act of covering. These subtle processes expose the fine distinctions in how mental functioning operates. on how ego processes allow certain material to enter into consciousness while barring others, which is to be differentiated from the speech utterance of free association and the enunciation of that material, which may or may not be met with censorship or resistance, and on the defensive and transferential processes operative intrapsychically and within the analytic dyad. But we may ask, what does it mean for something to show itself? A slip, an unintentional behavior or utterance, forgetfulness, a bundled action. All these, are these not disclosures or revelations of a particular kind? Spontaneous gestures reveal a truth. Psychoanalysis generally presupposes that there are meaningful communications, as disclosures, transmuted through these acts. The event itself is manifest. How we come to interpret its signification is another matter. When Heidegger discusses the concept of logos and truth, he tells us that discourse, as logos, lets something be seen by making it manifest and accessible to another party. The character of speaking authentically, in particular, reveals a certain truth to be made manifest, and hence seen as something which is taken out of its hiddenness. The, quote, being true of logos is therefore made manifest or seen as the unhidden, which must be discovered or uncovered. That which is seen is that which is unconcealed. However, we may need to be looked at because, it can escape notice, as our perceptions are not always sufficiently attuned to that which is disclosed. This is in contrast to, quote, being false, which is an act of deceiving or covering up something so it cannot be seen, such as by deliberate obstruction, by placing something in front of something else so it may not be seen, or as unconscious defense or unconcealment. We can readily see how the ancient concept of truth can apply to the consulting room. The notion of truth as discovery, contra construction, is the immediate presentation of something, what Hegel refers to as sense certainty, of a showing itself, that which is unveiled, the naked truth. Here truth is a presencing of a particularized being, a self-revealing of itself. Picture the process of free association as the analysand speaks whatever comes to mind. Each utterance, or its omission, signifies an unconscious communication as well as a meaning. So does silence. The trick, elusive and difficult as it may be, is in understanding the nuances and discrepancies within the contextual moment in which truth may be released, partially breached, or foreclosed altogether. Of course, in practice, free association is fraught with internal resistances, denial, refutations, censorship, interpersonal reservations, and countertransference enactments that stymie or occlude the pure self-revealing of intrapsychic phenomena. This intricate dynamic typifies the overdetermined, defensive nature of mental processes, reflective of an inherent split in agency that is divided in its purposes and revelatory confessions, hence falling under the rubric of compromise formation and felt intrusions, whether fantasized or real, from the analyst-other. Yet the mere mobilization of resistive and reactive internal pressures from the analysand point toward the presence of agentic forces designed to safeguard against the disclosure of particular truths it finds threatening. while securing a clearing for others to manifest as unconcealment. I don't know if any of you have been in psychoanalysis, but as a psychoanalyst, I have been analyzed. And it's a very powerful process. You think you know yourself until you are in treatment. And slowly, elements of yourself become more transparent to who you really are and your capacity for self-reflection. But at the same time, there are certain things we do not want to know about ourselves, that we fight, that we deny. And overcoming those resistances is part of the process itself. Now, although analysts work differently, I mean, there's a huge discrepancy in the way psychoanalysis is conducted. It's not just Freud, but most philosophers aren't aware of the movements and changes in the field. We do work differently in our therapeutic work, but we often listen to manifest content, or the themes, or the derivatives, and the emotional valences, thus waiting patiently for latent material and past patterns to resurface, when spontaneously we sense the incongruity or feel the discontinuity. We observe the slip. We hear the broken utterance, the pause, the silence, the confusion, the patient's self-conscious hesitancy, or lack of clarity, and so on. Faulty achievements, what they call the Freudian slip, are the revelation of unconscious phenomena, the conveyance of buried truths. The slip that breaches the gap into consciousness reveals its unconscious essence. That which appears is freed from its concealment, even if unintentional or by accident. For Freud, the ontology of unconscious truth is epitomized by the occurrence of dreams or parapraxies and symptoms, like the dream's navel, a convoluted mass of condensation and displacement. Truth remains at once exposed, yet interred. Unconscious truth is partially disclosed in these moments, and it is not merely a matter of constructing their significance or interpreting a resistance. Of course, meta-truths are operative here, as the analyst engages in a parallel process of one's own in relation to the intersubjective system itself. Contra the notion of construction and reconstruction in analysis, here truth is not in making something out of that which appears, such as the co-creation of meaning in the therapeutic dyad, although that could be a later focus of logos as a hermeneutical framing by revisiting that which previously manifested. But the point I wish to emphasize here is that truth pre-reflexively presents itself as itself. It is not assigned or co-constructed, rather it's disclosed as self-disclosure, the self-showing of phenomenon. Here, meaning interpretation becomes a second order of structuring or emergent property of this original manifestation. Heidegger's apophantical or predicate discourse, which is derived from Husserl, is primarily concerned with a secondary form of disclosing, namely talk. But he wants to trace its original union to the letting show self of phenomenon, or to the things themselves. How would this look like for the psychoanalyst? Despite the fact that Heidegger rejected the psychoanalytic concept of the unconscious, his preoccupation with discovering truth within the recalcitrant realm of that which is hidden speaks to an unconscious ontology in which its purpose, or telos, is to show itself. There are several distinct moves or activities in which this can occur. One, in the act of opening, or making to open. We may investigate a state of openness. Ultimately, for Heidegger, this is Dasein. For our purposes, the human being who's there in the world. Two, to open up into openness also prepares a spacing or establishes a clearing for a disclosure, one that may appear or have the potential to appear. And finally, three, the disclosedness itself, that which shines forth is self-showing. At this stage, there is a determinate quality to what manifests. That which has become open is the object of our investigation, and that which is disclosed is the product of its self-manifestation. This implies some form of agency at work. Here it may not be inappropriate to make a comparison between the unconscious agentic act of preparing a psychic space for openness, such as in treatment, or while free associating, or during the course of recollection or working through certain developmental traumas, where a clearing or region for openness is pruned away and becomes host to a whole sea of potential objects to be made manifest, and that which are specifically made determinate, such as memories, images, desires, affects, and so on, hence that which is concretely disclosed. Being in the open is where revealedness occurs. This may metaphorically signify the consulting room, or psychic reality, or analytic discourse. And what is the condition or agent of therapeutic action? It is in creating a psychological atmosphere for the clearing to transpire. To me, it seems essential that nurturing the ground, as well as tending to the garden for a clearing to take place, determines when and what will reveal itself. This could be the genuine article, or a covering over of that article with a facade, itself a form of disclosedness, yet one that keeps the original artifact hidden. From this standpoint, whatever manifests is a disclosure. One may quibble over the authenticity of the disclosure, such as, it is not really truth because the repressed object remains hidden, or the censor barrier prevented a further revealing, or the defense overshadowed the original wish, or the conscious ego dismisses the disclosure or resists the interpretation, and so on. But this does not negate the fact that psychic phenomenon is potentially infinite. If we only look at truth from the vantage point of correspondent state of affairs, or consensual assent to propositions or facts, or warranted assertability as justified belief, then we miss the point, hence the manifestation, because we are reverting to a discourse on correctness. Is there any such thing as a correct defense? Or are there merely revelations, revealings, as unconscious articulation? The unconscious speaks the truth, but not the whole truth at once. What remains hidden can be revealed, only then to be covered over by another articulation, or covered up entirely as a reburial, a return to the grave of repression. One enactment may serve to promote a false truth, which is a disguise or persona in order to cover over or reconceal an earlier appearance. But there is an unconscious intention in this act of negation, the intention to present another appearance that promotes a false presence, yet one that is nevertheless revealed. Here the lie is present, although it may remain hidden, perhaps even concealed from itself as self-deception. We are not aware of our self-deception because one who is in possession of the truth or genuine knowledge is aware that one is lying by concealing a certain truism, as Sartre famously pointed out. An unconscious manifestation, to the contrary, is the revelation of a lie to oneself that has been opened. And what is the role of the analyst? On the one hand, the analyst is the opener, for the analytic encounter sets the stage for preparing a proper clearing for psychic exploration. But I would also suggest this role is primarily privileged by the subject who discloses, because it is the agent behind such that allows an opening, as well as the material that is disclosed. Yet the process of opening is mutually implicative in the analytic relationship. On the other hand, the analyst is the discoverer, as the work of uncovering is facilitated by the carefully fostered and organic ambience of the therapeutic relationship. Perhaps the analyst is the first to witness the manifest as it surfaces, especially as the patient educationally acquires training and introspection and self-observation through the analytic method. In fact, Heidegger specifically refers to the logos that transpires in the speech act between interlocutors as the space where signification is acquired, quote, in its relation to something in its relatedness, end quote. Here, interpretation unfolds within a relationship where potential multiple meanings surface from a clearing based on a certain setting forth, exhibiting, laying out, recounting, and so forth, that transparently applies to the clinical encounter. I'd like to be able to bring this lofty discussion down to a clinical illustration, maybe to make my point more concrete. There are countless examples from clinical experience that any analyst can draw upon to illustrate the power of unconscious disclosingness as the revelation of a hidden truth. Here I wish to present a fragment of a session from a patient who was about 1 year into his 6-year analytic treatment. Rather than focus on the historical dynamics of his case and his developmental traumas, due to constraints here, I'll present the following interchange as the patient associated from the couch. A central theme is the patient's life at this time, meaning the time of the narrative, was his inability to see women as both loving, nurturing subjects and sexual beings, which he tended to compartmentalize and keep unintegrated rather than form a holistic meta-representation. He had a previous suicide attempt following the breakup from a, quote, sexually aggressive woman, end quote, whom he desired, yet he was repulsed by, which led him to reactively seek more meek and, quote, safer women who were non-threatening, yet, quote, boring and plain. He had just begun dating a new girlfriend at this time, and just immediately before this exchange that I will read, we were discussing the, quote, lines between love and sex that he felt were, quote, blurred in his mind. You'll have to forgive me, I'm not a very good actor, so this is going to be a little bit stilted, but hopefully you'll get the gist. So the patient associates and says, we were lying in bed, and I wanted to tell her about what we had talked about my mom and dad, even my brother, that I always felt like I had to chase their love. and she tried to comfort me. I was teary-eyed when we started to talk. She was laying there with me. Then she started to touch my crotch. And I yelled out, "What are you doing?" And I just started bawling. She apologized and she held me. I couldn't stop. She kept stroking my hair. It felt so good. There's a period of silence. He resumes. Earlier that night, I put my face on her belly. I remember when I was a little boy, around 7. I went to my parents' room because I had an earache. And Mom lifted her nightgown and said, put my ear on her belly because it was warm. I remember it seemed kind of odd, but it was so comforting. She never gave affection or hugs. Another period of silence. I notice I like to touch people when I talk, like women's hair. She wouldn't let me touch her hair when I was little. She'd just get all pissed off. There's a really long period of silence. I decide to say, what is it about touch? I don't know. It's confusing. What comes to mind? I can't seem to separate between these lines. Lines you just don't cross. At that point, there's silence, and he says, I remember now. I was up at my aunt's cottage in New Brunswick, sitting on a picnic table with my mom and my aunt and me, and Mom and her were talking about sex or something. And Mom said, are you small? No. Are you big or what? And she poked me right in the crotch. And I said, Mom? And she said in the back, Mom? Like she was making fun of me. There's a period of silence. This is the first time I've thought of this since then. And he starts weeping. I couldn't believe she would touch my penis. She wasn't supposed to do that. And he starts sobbing profusely with his hands in his face. That's the end of the narrative. When you interpret this clinical phenomenon, I should say whether you interpret this clinical phenomenon from the standpoint of seduction, repression, and Oedipalization, from the standpoint of dissociation and relational trauma, forgotten sexual abuse, and or a mixture of symptom formation, fantasy, and retrieved memory, what is important to emphasize is the spontaneous process of resurfacing of a prior truth that had remained consciously absent, yet unconsciously present until now. In fact, there are myriad truths that can be unpacked from this narrative, the most dominant of which spoke for the subject. We may further suggest that the analytic milieu nurtured a permissible psychic space that allowed for a certain opening to forge in the patient's mind, which then enabled a specific discovery as unveiling to naturally ensue, where the particularized truth was revealed as mnemonic linkages were recovered. My initial question stimulated discontinuity in the patient's associational chain, which surprised the unconscious, so to speak. My adoption of the patient's language, when pointing out the unthought known, fostered a clearing for truth to be disclosed, hence freed from the grave of repression. Unconscious productions that expose themselves through psychic appearances take on innumerable forms, many of which are pre-reflectively instituted, that is, unintentionally divulged. In this clinical example, truth instituted itself, which obliged further truths to be explored and analyzed, as others were revealed. But a certain problematic arises when we view the truth of phenomena as merely pre-reflexive, or in other words, as tautologically self-instantiating. I am reminded here of Fichte's absolute self, that posits or asserts itself, hence thinks itself into existence. This is untenable without taking into account a material, embodied foundation or corporeality within which mind emerges. We must account for an original ground for any phenomena to appear. If phenomena are pure self-showing, then there is an endless universe of truths as that which spontaneously self-manifests. But why should we grant the status of truth to that which manifests? Quite plainly, because whatever exists is true. Yet we have already determined that predication necessarily makes truth contingent on the relativity of perspective and the relationality of signification based on apophansis. Here we need to reflect upon the base circumstances that make such determinations possible. The propositional acts of relativity and relationality must emanate from an essential ontology, that which conditions all phenomena. In other words, we cannot speak of the manifest until we address the ground, or grund, that makes the manifest possible. In order for there to be appearance at all, it must derive from an original a priori ground. That which manifests is actual. Whatever exists is true. But what happens when truth presents itself as truth when it is merely semblance, or recedes back into the underworld of its original hiddenness once it has revealed itself? Once again, this implies an agentic factor at play. And here, Heidegger could not elude the spectra of the dialectic. In his essay on the essence of truth, Heidegger continues his analysis of revealed being as transpiring within a clearing that opens a space for unconcealment. Equally, as each space reveals the potentiality for truth to appear as phenomenon, there is also conversely a closing, in that truth may only be revealed in the wake of concealment. Such movement of uncovering in the presence of covering underlies the dialectical organization of truth. As Heidegger elucidates, discourse or talk is the primary fulcrum for the logos of truth to be disclosed. Truth proceeds out from the very thing we are talking about, for truth is a self-showing articulation. Here we are interested in the phenomenology of truth, hence its process and means of appearance, not necessarily how we know. Yet the two issues are inseparable, because the determination of truth is always a hermeneutical enterprise, for truth is conditioned by discourse. This process is not unlike the analytic method, for phenomena shows themselves through monologue during free association, as well as through dialogical exchange. Truth ensues from talk. In effect, it speaks for itself. Here I am reminded of patients who, after a lengthy flow of speaking out loud their internal chain of thoughts, discover something known but forgotten, something previously hidden but now exposed. We should not be surprised when our patients say, "I knew that all along," for the unconscious speaks a dialectical language. Whether truth is disclosed as revealed repression or formulated dissociative experience, there are simultaneously other psychic processes that are dialectically operative in such acts, such as ancillary reactions of covering over the bare phenomenon. I'm reminded of Freud's paper on negation, when somebody says, my mother didn't say that. The mere act of negation is itself an assertion of a denial of an unconscious truth. There's subsequent censoring or barring of further material from entering into consciousness, therefore remaining cloaked, as uncovering leads to recovering. Here the dialectics of truth tell a saga of the concealed unforgotten. When Freud instituted the fundamental rule as a pledge to honesty, literally, you are obligated to speak whatever comes into your mind without censoring it. He observed truth as the inverse of honesty, as the radical, albeit genuine, rejection of the imposition itself. Conventional discourse is not to be fully honest, not to say whatever you think without censoring it. These defenses are socially conditioned from childhood. Therefore, to betray the self-preservative element of defense is not natural. That is why it is only by accident, by the unintentional slip or faulty achievement, that truth is revealed. The ethic of honesty during free association is met with an innate tendency towards self-censorship, or resisting awareness of the surfacing material, negating the significance of certain verbalizations, or the analyst's inquiries or interpretations, and so forth. Or a covering over, such as disavowal, undoing, minimization, reversal, etc., in the winnowing of unconcealedness. For every surfacing, there is a countermeasure, and for every burying over, there is a later resurfacing. And what is buried over may remain undiscovered, or it can be re-excavated. What arises may return. This is what Heidegger meant when he referred to the binary of covering up in the shadow of uncovering. Yet, as I have described so far, this is a simple dialectical repetition of the reiteration of opposites. For Heidegger, the uncoveredness of truth is Dasein, there, in its existential contingency, as its elemental state of being. We are born into a world already constituted, yet always in a process of becoming. In Heidegger's words, quote, Dasein's disclosedness is the most primordial phenomenon of truth attained, end quote. And like unconscious order, this is not transparent. We exist in a world and alongside other entities in the world and within our own internal world and for our own relatedness to self and others equiprimordially with and through the world that is always temporally transmuting, hence shifting the field and figure ground of our perspectives. This is why Heidegger insists that the structure of our disclosedness lies hidden. But what he fails to say or accept is that our primordial structure is unconsciously constituted. Our most basic constitution of being there as phenomena is the essence of truth, because Dasein is its disclosure and is in the truth. This is an ontological claim, therefore not merely an epistemological determination, as some proponents of truth wish to have it. In other words, truth is real, but elusive. Disclosedness is factical, yet abstruse. What is not specifically addressed by Heidegger, but implicit all along in his treatment of Dasein, is the unconscious manifestations of disclosedness. We are thrown into existence. This is part of our historicity and is an objective empirical fact. Those who wish to dismiss salient realism are misguided, for the pre-phenomenological presence of the past is an ontological principle already constitutive of the human being. Elsewhere, I'd refer to this as archaic primacy, for the past metaphysically conditions the present and future, despite the fact that it may not determine the developmental path or vicissitudes of the experiential subject. Our thrownness presupposes an unconscious ontology because it is the original ground of being, a ground without a ground, an umgrund, that conditions the potential for disclosures, openness, and that which is open, as well as that what is concealed, covered over, and returned to the antediluvian origins of its unconscious abyss. Heidegger also elevates the disclosive property of projection as the human subject's being toward its potentiality and future possibilities. Here, Dasein is a bid for freedom, an expression of its, quote, ownmost being for self, end quote. And this is what differentiates truth as the subject's pursuit of authenticity versus its existential tendency to fall into the inauthenticity or falseness. This is where Heidegger institutes the dialectical necessity of the polarity of movement Dasein is destined to enact. All human beings vacillate between authentic and inauthentic modes of being, which are ontologically given as a formal condition of the truth of Dasein's disclosiveness. In actuality, not merely abstraction, it is Dasein in the authentic modes of comporting, relating, and disclosing that differentiates its transcendental moments from its ordinary, corrupt, and pathological ways of being in the world as a falsehood. What is pivotal in any substantive discussion of Dasein's falseness is the presence and ubiquity of our pathos, which is a necessary, albeit not sufficient, unconscious condition of what it means to be human. Heidegger refers to this condition as our fallenness, our proclivity to lapse into lassitude, to close off and cover up, to hide and disguise, to listen to the they and accept gossip, idle curiosity, ambiguity, and fiction as truth. To be human is to suffer, and this indisputable truism is part of the dialectical manifestation of Dasein's process of unconcealment, in the act of concealment. The dialectical structure of being human is to be both in truth within untruth. It's double face. Heidegger makes the interesting observation that truth must be, quote, wrestled from entities, which gets, quote, snatched out from its hiddenness. What does it mean to snatch truth? I take this to signify that truth must be extracted from its closures. It must be wrestled out of its unopenness. Here I'm reminded of analytic technique, the Socratic method of questioning, the interpretive stance, the treatment environment itself that prepares a clearing for seizing truth. Interpretation explains things, provides a framework for understanding, and at the same time it pokes holes in appearances, hence penetrating semblances, unmasking pretenses, and creating apertures into unconscious processes by taking blinders away, which robs patients of their ignorance by exposing them to their discovered situation in a new light. The Greeks defined truth through a privative expression, aletheia, through the via negativa, a negation or reversal of the closed, the unseen. Can this fanciful dichotomization all be brought into view as a whole? Heidegger does not profess to have a grand synthesis of everything, unlike Hegel's philosophy of spirit. His project of fundamental ontology, outlined in Sein und Zeit, ends abruptly, offering no closure or finality. The truth of being remains unfinished. In this sense, there is no proper conclusion, just a sober, open-endedness. Perhaps this is a fitting, given that truth and falsehood are disclosed as an endless multiplicity within the compound structures of worldhood, shrouded in a hidden underworld where there is no ultimate sublation, Aufhebung, or absolute overarching process driving the nature of disclosedness itself. It merely is. Truth lies in the endless manifestation of appearances that in themselves shine forth as authentic phenomena, insofar as they simply happen. But by themselves, they are only micro-units of a greater totality, or unfolding process of becoming. In this sense, truth is a cosmic enterprise, yet one that reveals itself as momentary intercessions. We may never experience or know them all at once, except perhaps as an abstract logical category. But we may ask, is there an overarching supraordinate thrust governing this manifold of appearances, or at least a primordial foundation that underlies their appearances as such? This is a metaphysical question that hinges on the legitimacy of positing a priori principles. The unconscious is an a priori posit, something confirmed yet unseen. But it is precisely that we posit it, S, that gives credence to its presence. That which appears emanates from a prior ground. And the principle of sufficient reason tells us that every mental event must stand in relation to every mental object, which proceeds from prior events. Here we are looking for a causal connection. These processes of becoming, ripening within the larger structural parameters or ontological forces that allow their appearances to materialize in the first place. That is, within the principal core configurations of the dialectic that accounts for the underlying unity of knowledge to slowly manifest, although this process is never fully complete. It is only by looking back at the process that we can see its self-articulated dynamic progression as complex holism. This is precisely the Hegelian project Heidegger distances himself from, yet ultimately respects. Here it may be said that Heidegger cannot be understood without understanding Hegel. I'm almost done. For Hegel, mind is historically constituted within nature, meaning material embodiment, and dialectically traces its own logical and real, meaning substantive, succession as civilization or culture, Bildung, hence taking into account the burgeoning process of cognition and subjectivity as universality within an objective world that seeks and progressively achieves pure self-consciousness as thought thinking about itself and its operations, as its ethical, aesthetic, rational, and spiritual culmination. Although Heidegger offers no Hegelian culmination, his project is compatible with a mutually shared fundamental ontology that conditions worldhood and the possibility for selfhood to disclose itself. Heidegger's revisitation of truth, post-being and time, is to focus on the irresolute question of openness, one that resists representation in all its obscurity and coverings. Here we may observe more closely the tension in his thinking through his own vacillation between viewing aletheia as more concealing versus revealing in its disclosedness. Once again, the comparison to unconscious processes is translucent. The signification and puzzling operations of sheltering within the space of clearing allows for, quote, lighting to transpire. The, quote, withdrawal of being in the face of illumination, ergo enlightenment or insight, points toward the double-centeredness of desire, each ensuring a double appearance of opposition. We desire and we deny. We want, yet disavow. We affirm and negate. Double truth. Desire and drive, aim toward multiple objects derived from multiple purposes, but they always stand in relation to lack, a lack that is unfulfillable. The overall pattern that emerges is tantamount to a cybernetic system of regulatory structures, constraints, and possibilities. Each movement cancels the other out as it instantiates itself, only to be canceled out by another antithetical process, which thereby sets into motion the same pattern of instituting self-sameness in response to difference. Competing dialectics are in opposition to each other, yet require one another to exist. For each is subsumed and mutually implicative. Here we cannot totally elude the Hegelian dialectic. For every act of uncovering followed by covering, every disclosure receding into reconcealment points to the preservative function of sublation. Truth is unconsciously retained, even when recovered or annulled. Heidegger makes the claim that truth reveals itself as freedom, which is its very essence. For Heidegger, what truth is really about is essence, not things, but rather about what makes something what it is. Here he returns to his ancient roots. This requires us to think about the ground of truth, what is truly fundamental, that which makes truth possible. Heidegger's conclusion is that, quote, the essence of truth is the truth of essence, end quote. This is not a simple tautology. Essence is what makes things what they really are. And thinking about the nature of essence should be the loci of our critical inquiry. And for Hegel, essence must appear in order for anything to be made actual. In other words, truth exists. Despite the fact that Heidegger reintroduced philosophy to the question of truth in 1927 by revisiting the ancients, which became a lifelong preoccupation with his enunciation of the truth of being, he failed to appreciate that unconcealment as the manifest is the instantiation of unconscious self-revelation. What this means is that unconscious agency is an a priori organization that reveals itself through the manifestations of consciousness. In other words, the unconscious is the house of being. And here we have a genuine psychoanalytic theory of truth.
John, thank you very much for this. Now we shall proceed to the discussion of what you have presented to us in this brilliant and intricate presentation. Can we handle the truth? To quote Jack Nicholson from the movie. Okay, questions?
I have a question about the unconscious truth. As we see, do you think that the unconscious truth is the essence? Do you interpret unconscious truth as the
To answer the first part of the question, my view is that what drives us ultimately is an unconscious process, or to be more specific, unconscious processes. And consciousness and self-consciousness is just merely a surface. And yet at the same time, consciousness and self-consciousness are conditioned on our unconscious natures. So you can't have one without the other. So in that sense, it is literally essential to understand our unconscious constellations, because it is what makes us necessarily who we are as human beings. Of course, it is not to boil down or reduce the human being to our unconscious natures. It is just to try to fully appreciate more of who we are in our depths. And so, essence in this way is what makes everything else possible. What makes us who we are, and hence it conditions all appearances. The second part of the question is it necessary for us to revisit our past in order to find truth? And again, if we need to look at truth not as one thing, but as a multiplicity of and variety of competing processes. So on one hand, by revisiting our past, one is reminded all the time of what we used to be, what we once were, and where we've become. Certain elements of our lives from childhood are indelibly ingrained in the very psychic structure or fabric of our being. Others have been overcome, transcended, transmuted, evolved. So I'm not the same person I was when I was a child, but nevertheless, certain elements of my childhood very much live within me. So in one way, yes, I think it can enrich who we are by revisiting our past. Do we restructure our truths by doing so? Absolutely.
So it is characteristic for psychoanalysis that it privileges the past, the things, the events in the past.
Absolutely. Like I mentioned, there's a metaphysical condition. This is our primacy, our archaic past cannot be denied, just like your cultural history cannot be denied. It is there. Now, whether or not we're always thinking about it, focusing on it is another issue. But to negate it, it would be a mistake. But it becomes subsumed within who we are today. Of course, many people wish to forget their past because it was painful. And they may have succeeded in doing so. They may have sublimated their past pains into other types of academic, intellectual, aesthetic, spiritual types of pursuits. But it doesn't negate the fact that the past has conditioned that process, but not determined. It's not a fundamental determinant, process where you are, I guess you're not free if you view it that way. You have the power within yourself to interpret and to transmute and to have some type of agentic influence over the past. And that's what we see when people go through treatments. They often feel a need to heal, and they can only heal on some level by revisiting their life.
What is the analyst's role in revealing the truth? And is all the content coming from a patient?
The analyst's role in what?
In revealing the truth, in finding the truth, and is all the content of the truth coming from a patient?
It's a complex question because there are many different analytic schools and many different analytic ways of approaching therapeutic praxis. So, on one hand, it's genuinely uncontested that you have two human beings in a room, and the intersubjective dynamics that transpire through talking, discourse, is going to lead down certain paths. And hence, the analyst, if depending upon the tradition they're trained in, tries to open the clearing for a certain path, then, of course, that is a relational dynamic. Most people need another person to talk to in order to fully understand other things about themselves. If that was the case, we'd just be content with living in our own heads and contemplating the universe. But when you dialogue with another person, certain things come out, certain things are triggered. And so in that way, it's clearly a two-way dynamic. Or two-person psychology is what we say in our field. On the other hand, as the patient is the one in the driver's seat. Maybe I might influence what direction they should go. I'm like the GPS, go down here, here, here. But that is a person's process, and that will lead in a number of directions that are not predetermined.
Maria?
Thank you very much for your very interesting interpretation of Martin Heidegger, with whom philosopher of whom I have been working on about 30 years. And for example, even his allies, for example, Richard Rorty, is criticizing Heidegger for essentialism, and you interpreted essence in a processual way, which was very interesting. Do you know about his meetings with Medard de Vos?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in his meetings, the rejection of unconsciousness is not so clear. Of course, Edmund Husserl was the phenomenologist who would refute unconsciousness. Then, the follower of Husserl and Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he also was at some congress of psychoanalysts, and he said there is no unconsciousness, because if we speak about it, it means it is conscious. But of course, these two philosophers, these three philosophers, don't deny unconsciousness because it is real, as you said. But you deceived us, because you said that you were not a good actor, whereas when you were presenting this clinic case, you were so attuned to the patient that we felt that dramatic atmosphere. So, do you think that verbal rejection of unconsciousness is just nothing? And if Heidegger denies unconsciousness, that's just the words.
Well, it's interesting that, Heidegger had a mental breakdown when he went through the denazification commission and was interrogated, and became so depressed that he attempted suicide. Was he consciously intending to do this, or were there certain dark forces in himself who felt impelled to self-harm? Unfortunately, I don't think we need to get into a dichotomy between consciousness and unconsciousness. I know that phenomenologists love to do that, but even with Merleau-Ponty and the other phenomenological schools, they're talking about embodiment. And hence, natural desire, our impulses, often are telling us, communicating to us in a very real and embodied way certain things we would like to do or not do or prohibit. And of course, sexuality and aggression are one of the most difficult things to contend with. And is that always a conscious, let alone rational enterprise? Some people in my circles, meaning contemporary psychoanalytic circles, like to negate drive theory. But what is the most obvious thing in the world? What do we see every day in the papers, on the internet, on the TV? The whole world is about sex and aggression. You can't turn on the TV set in the morning without, hearing the TV screaming. It tells us something very powerful about who we are, and yet, yet I guess it's in vogue to take sides when. Even Husserl, in his later days, in his lectures on active and passive synthesis, he certainly is opening up a whole realm of unconscious mentation when he's talking about passive synthesis. So if we look at Kant, if we look at Kant's entire system, you have the transcendental unity of apperception, which is a formal unification system in the mind. That's an unconscious, impersonal process. And I would argue it's an agentic process. The thing is that we get back to your question about essence. Again, I know essence has a bad word because we typically think of some medieval, substance ontology. And when I really think that we should look at it in terms of what makes something what it is, without which it couldn't exist. And so that's what I mean when I'm using that term.
Amazing. More questions? I don't see anyone, so I'll take the opportunity to ask my own question. Concerning the Socrates' distortion of truth, which you briefly alluded to.
Which one is that?
You have briefly alluded to Heidegger's opinion that it was Socrates' error or even mistake to induce us to perceive the truth as some kind of fixity, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas you seem to be, you're overwhelmingly arguing for the processual and infinite aspect of truth. What interests me is what was the source, or what kind of error was committed by Socrates that led us astray from this adequate understanding of truth.
My interpretation is that Heidegger felt that looking at the Socratic or Platonic or Aristotelian notion as correctness was incorrect, and he wanted to redefine truth by revisiting Aletheia.
And the second part of the question is concerning language, because we know from Socrates and Platonic and Aristotelian understanding of truth that they have been understanding as some kind of congruence between verbal expression of and the reality to which those verbal expressions refer to, sentences, basically, or concepts also. To what extent, you have touched upon this, but I would like to revert to this point anyway. To what extent language is conducive to the disclosure of truth, and to what extent it does the work of covering it back yet again in your practice, or also in your theoretical research. So.
Of course, you've got a whole school of thought that hinges on the linguistic turn in philosophy. And if I might simplify it, I know there's nuances here, but it seems like many people in the postmodern genre want to boil everything down to language. And everything is then, language determines and conditions everything. Or is the semiotics that saturate our very being in determining the truth and value of whatever we discuss. But Heidegger may fall into that camp, of course. He talks about language as a house of being. However, he refers to discourse or talk as a second ordering of truth, as a second ordering of phenomenon. And so, more primordially, he would talk about, the whole of Dasein is truth. And hence, if we can look at that, let's say, for instance, a baby. The baby's born in the world. The baby doesn't have language. Yet it's constituted within worldhood and in relation to its own inner experiences, whether they be biologically motivated or not, as well as in relation to its familiar environment, and particularly the bond with the mother. And so there's a primordialness to that fromness. Now, I have argued that you can even have a primary unconscious ontology that is grounded in the semiotics prior to language, formal articulate language, prior to the birth of the subject as a linguistic being. And in fact, this unconscious ontological foundation makes subjectivity and discourse, language, possible. But I don't see it as necessarily antagonistic or at odds with one another. It's more of a Hegelian move, that you have a base organic development that is then epigenetically evolves into more rich and robust forms of human consciousness. So on one hand, the notion of talk and discourse is crucial, essential to our being in the world. And it's certainly crucial to my therapeutic field. So you can't do a lot with someone who's mute, but you can do a lot with little children with play techniques that don't even speak. And yet that's a form, perhaps, of language, of communication, of discourse.
Ah, I see. Okay. So we can understand the language as something much wider than just a form of phenomenon. Okay, thank you. More questions? Julian.
I have a question about the relation. Is the relation, or would be the relation between psychoanalytics of truth with neurosciences? The new research has been conducted on the brain, using neuroimaging, MRI, and so on. And what would be the relation? Would neurosciences change some assumptions or notions set up here in the psychoanalytics of truth? Is there a possibility for changing of the assumptions of the basis with the new discoveries made in neuroscience?
There's a whole new field or discipline or subdiscipline within psychoanalysis called neuropsychoanalysis. And it's probably the new hot topic for the last 10 years. So cognitive scientists of many forms, as well as psychoanalytic researchers, are very much interested in having a nice simpatico with one another. And so therefore that school of thought wants to show through means of physicality, through MRI, functional MRIs, PET scans, all these things, that there are unconscious regions of the brain that are active and that are, influential over human thought and behavior. I think in many ways it's adding to more of a consilience of knowledge, to use Edward O. Wilson's term. So there's more of a fundamental unity when you engage the physical sciences. Many analytic practitioners could care less. It doesn't translate to the fact that we still need to dialogue and talk with people. Just because you have some element of your brain that's lit up doesn't mean I'm going to have a certain technique that I would change. Yet there are other people that very much have applied analytic technique in novel ways or in different ways. And one is in relation to trauma. So there's a whole field of traumatology studies and helping people overcome, let's say, post-traumatic stress disorder, where they need, let's say, to have certain narratives that are articulating, their traumas. And some experimental methods that have been found useful is that they put a person into more of a relaxed state through psychopharmacology, because it helps with the arousal systems that get generated when you start to ask a person to relive a trauma. So when somebody's reflooded with a trauma, they have to think about what happened to them. Their brain kicks into a hyperactive or a hypomanic state, and it floods the brain with the capacity. You can't synthesize what's happening. But when they're given, let's say, an anti-anxiety medication, and they're more calm, but they can talk about it, it allows them to verbalize and work through things better. And then it can be integrated a little bit more easily. So to answer your question, there's a lot of new and interesting developments in that field that are not necessarily antagonistic to what I have to say.
Okay. Agnieszka?
There is still in your website, I noticed that you are an artist also, a painter.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the so-called aesthetic truth. Do you think that our talking arts, revealing by arts, do you think that we can talk about any kind of aesthetic truth? And would it be a truth of appearing, interpreting, or maybe expressing the unconscious?
Well, I do think there's a whole minefield that can be stepped into, as well as mind in that area. I certainly think that Carl Jung had introduced us to understanding the creative elements of the unconscious, and so I think any form of aesthetic expression is a part of our soul that needs to be articulated, whatever medium we're talking about, whether it be writing, whether it be more creative works, whether it be painting or sculpture or any of the arts. Of course, Hegel would view that as one of the heightened elevations of human consciousness. Freud would refer to it as a great example of sublimation. whatever your creative pursuits are, it is the sublation of unconscious processes. And how many truths come out in that, what can we glean from it, is, I suppose, a very intimate enterprise.
More questions? No? Sure. Ursula, over there.
You mentioned that, but you could just for a while go back to the problem of the role of the patient in the process of the viewing of the appearances. So is appearance always relative to perception, or is it independent of perception, or is it only partly dependent on perception? Can something appear and not be perceived, or is it always interrelated?
Well, I suppose on an ontological level, things may appear independent of our perception. Things transpire all the time, and we're not attuned to them. But because discursive truth requires an interpretive act, it would require some capacity for perceptibility. And so, in that way, I think it certainly would require some perception.
Hold on, because some people have to get to the next classes. If one has to leave, let's please take this opportunity now to leave it, and we'll continue the discussion. It's
independently of the process of perceiving and interpreting. Are these truths certain whether ontological facts or whether interpretative facts, or emerging only in the process of reflection, and as such are always relative to perception?
On one hand, I have a certain bias, and the bias is that everything must be conditioned on prior a priori principles. So an appearance, by definition, must emanate from a prior ground. Whether or not we are able to perceive it when it appears is then another issue. But when we do perceive things, our perceptions there become more clear, and then we superimpose our own interpretive acts on what we are now witnessing. In many ways, both can transpire at the same time, but one may be more fundamental than the other. Yeah.
Any more questions?
One more question. What do you think about that what you mentioned, Lacan? And what do you think about his statement that in psychoanalysis it's not the question of the reality, but it is the question of the truth? opposition between reality and truth. It's very characteristic. What do you think about it?
Well, that's again a convoluted topic. Lacan's system is very, it's almost a reversal of most conventional categories. So, on one hand, he makes the real the domain of the unconscious. It's desire, but it's completely ineffable. It's the realm of the Ding and Zeek, the thing in itself. You don't know it, but it appears. It appears through the symbolic and through the imaginary. But I don't fully know what Lacan means by truth. First of all, I don't understand what.
But it's a general statement. Psychoanalysis works with the truth and not with the reality. So I think maybe it is a bit a situation when we are thinking about the psychological processes that it is so different and so specific that it does not concern the reality directly. So that it is something very specific, some specific region.
Well, if the truth does not take into consideration the real, meaning reality as we typically view it, then it doesn't sound like a very good treatment. What am I going to do? Am I going to foster delusions in my patient so they can walk out and interact in the real world in a way that's completely dysfunctional, let alone stimulate other fantasy systems that could be very destructive to their internal dynamics? So I think my approach would certainly be weighing against understanding what's more fantasized or imagined in my patients and weighing that with a reality principle.
But sometimes our research started from that point that we do not know ourselves. So the picture, the image of realities can be illusion, can be as an illusion. So I mean that he probably thought that our recognition of reality is such doubtful, so that in psychoanalysis the first thing is to know the truth, psychological truth. And it is the most important.
I think maybe to translate that language is that Lacan's approach would be focusing on the phenomenology of the patient's inner experiences. Yeah, and that, of course, could be everything based upon whatever is illusory versus what might be accurate or true or semi-true or whatever it may be. But put from that standpoint, that's no different than classical approach. We're more interested in a patient's fantasies, in their thoughts, their dreams, rather than is this an accurate depiction of what they're describing.
More questions? No more questions then. Jon, thank you very much for your excellent presentation.
Thank you
for this excellent discussion. Let us thank Jon for his appearance here.